Mike Linton, great to have you on the show. So you are a fellow evergreen podcaster. You have this huge background in marketing and with CRO, CMO in so many cool brands, Best Buy, Procter, to name, and eBay. I really wanted to get on this call and get to know a little bit more about you and your past and your learnings from what you've been up to. In your own words, Mike, who are you?
Gosh, Minter, what a big question. So I guess I will talk about myself professionally, which is I think I've always wanted to be on the edge of where the consumer meets the business, meets the market. And I love that kind of edge and the fight that goes on between brands. So that's who I am there. On the personal front, I think I'm always in it for the learning and the fun and the camaraderie, and then doing something that's fun and cool. So that's kind of a summary, I guess. I hope that's what you're looking for.
Well, hey, listen, you know what? I'm looking for you, and the energy, I can hear it in your voice.
Oh, good. Well, here I am.
So, all right, listen, you've worked in branding or marketing anyway for the large part. You're also on many boards. And so really what I wanted to look at to start with is, what do you consider branding and how has it changed over the years to where it is today?
I've always considered branding the same thing, but the management of the brand and the effort required to build the brand has, in my mind, altered dramatically. And also, so I'll start with what I consider a brand is the consumer buys a brand for the benefit the brand provides. And that may be very, very consistent, or it may be somewhat inconsistent, like the reason you might buy a really cool tennis shoe or a beer or something. It might be different, but in the end, the promise is very important to the customer, and the customer is paying the brand to do a job. And that promise is then delivered. I do not consider the brand just the marketing, and I think that is a huge mistake. The marketing is just the delivery of the promise. The brand then, in the experience, has to actually deliver the promise. I mean, you did a lot on shampoos and things, and you can say how great the shampoo is, but if it's not really great or you don't like the scent, it's not delivering on the promise. So I think the brand promise is still the same. The delivery of the promise, I think, is more complicated and harder today than it was years ago, because the judgment on the brand is very fast and quick. If the experience is poor, the brand will suffer. And then I think a lot of brands are being put in position where they are being encouraged to take stands on socio-political issues. And I think in many instances, that is probably not the best thing for the brand to be doing.
So the first thing you said in the way it's changed is the speed of judgment. And to what do you put that down to? And why was there not speed of judgment in the past?
Oh, I think, well, look, I've been in business for a long, long time, and pre-social media or pre-mobile, judgment took a long time. You know, if you were going to have a failure, you know, I can go back to when Intel had its bad chip or some other things happened. That failure has to work its way to the press and the media. Then it has to get to you, and then you have to realize there was a failure. Today, if there's a brand failure or a brand letdown, or the brand crosses a line that certain people don't like, that failure is immediately public and immediately shared. And so the brand, to me, has to always be on the experience front. And if it is going to have a bad experience, like an outage, you know, if you have a data breach or something, that is immediate, and thousands of people are pouncing on it, and then it gets amplified. And so I think right now, if you know, that brand promise has more fronts that need to be delivered than and at speed. And so that's what I would say. And also I will say, I think the marketplace has gotten more reactionary to problems than it used to be. Like any problem, made up or not, or anybody crosses the line or employee does something wrong, that is, you know, that can light up your brand.
So would you say then, in some regards, you and I were lucky to live in a period of obscurity, and then now it's all about transparency. It sort of feels like that's the conclusion of where we are.
Well, I would say it's transparency, whether you like it or not. And it's also my transparency is maybe not your transparency. There's certain things where, yeah, maybe financial results, we can all agree those are the financial results. Other things, whether the brand is a good value or whether you provide good customer service, those are a lot more situational and less clear, but that doesn't stop the brand from having to be in the center of that. And I also think the ability to build the brand over time, it used to be probably easier because you had control of one-way media, which was essentially television, radio, magazines, whatever you wanted, and the PR that went. And now you have, I'm not sure it's an interaction, but it is a 1,000 different receivers, 1,000 different channels, all making their own statements on value and judgment. And I will say, look, this is why I think it's so hard for Saturday Night Live to be as good as it used to be. There's no common ground anymore where everyone knows the same music, the same show, the same issues,
the same facts.
The same facts and I think it is much harder. And I think that's a similar kind of brand challenge for me, which is, 40 years ago when Saturday Night Live started, they could pick out commercials, for example, or movies or books that everyone had seen, and they could make fun of that. That is not the case now. So I think probably finding humor that is appreciated by large groups is more challenging.
Yeah, I love this this idea that my transparency isn't your transparency. I really relate to that. I've always thought that transparency has an agenda, and where our agendas don't match up. And I wanted to just comment on the comic story. I went to see a comedian in the West End here, and he made a really interesting remark. He said, if my audience doesn't have culture, then it's hard to be funny. Because in other words, I can say something, but if you don't know the second level,
right,
the sous-entendu underneath it, and you haven't got the references, so it sounds a little bit similar to that.
The word you just used, I don't even know what it was, but I think it was super, super cultured. So I probably wouldn't have been the right audience, but I do think there is what I'll talk about transparency too is my transparency is not your transparency, but also my context is not your context. And so the idea of transparency, I think, is very, very complicated for brands and communicators, since it is not, it's a concept. And that concept changes by where I start and the context I receive in. And just like your comedian, if I understand what that comedian is saying, it may be hilarious. If I have no idea, like that word you just used, where it was, I'm not sure what you said.
Subplot. The subplot.
Oh, that's what I said. Where I'm not even going to understand the transparency you gave me. And so I think that it's very challenging for brands, and also the expectations of the various receivers now have changed. And then the other thing that's changed, surely in my career, is you used to see almost all the media you could use and all the touch points that were important. And now there's so many different touch points and so many different media and so many different ways you can reach the consumer, that as a CMO or a revenue person, there is always more tests that you can run than you have people or money by an exponential factor. And so you have to pick the tests you're going to run, just the tests. And then most importantly, as a CMO or a CRO, you have to pick the tests you're not going to run. And that is super challenging. And I think that complexity has made, a whole bunch of these jobs and branding harder.
Yeah, I just as I was listening to you, I try to listen deeply, and sometimes my monkey brain turns on. And I was thinking about a conversation I had with an old time marketer who wrote the book "This Shit Will Not Sell," which is what they told him before
Yeah.
he invented a brand called Bailey's, which kind of
I know
sells.
Bailey's. I like Bailey's. Sometimes I put it in
You Irishman, you.
or on ice cream or other stuff
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
But they said it wouldn't sell. And he maintained and still maintains, you should not test. And at some level, I kind of want to agree with him now, because there's so many channels. There's a bias to the way you even input the channels and the people you choose, and not to mention the wording and the rest of it. I'm
more situational on this. I think there's a lot of stuff you can't test and you shouldn't test. And I also think, so I'll give you an example, situational. If I'm a startup business, if I just aggregate enough people and prove I have sales, I can get Series B funding, or I can get additional funding. All I have to do is aggregate sales and prove that there is a segment I can reach. As I get bigger, I probably have to get to real marketing and real brands. And I'm not sure that you could test something like Bailey's in the market, but my guess is you'd want to test like 10 or 15 versions of Bailey's before you lock down, at least in a focus group or other stuff, before you lock down on the final flavor. And you might test some of the packaging, and then you might test some of the distribution. I think there's an awful lot of testing you can do on efficiency fronts or kind of new fronts. But that certain things you're not going to test, like, and you can't.
My feeling is that my experience in marketing at L'Oreal, for the most part, we did lots of testing, especially lab testing on what it did for the hair and all this. My biggest success in terms of products, because that's a small part of the whole gig, right, was actually doing something that was untestable. Yeah. Where we launched something was really hard to do in the factory, so they didn't want to do it.
Right.
They were like, why are we doing this thing? It's 2 times more expensive than the next most expensive product ever sold in this industry. And was really weird. We had 42 files in a box, 42, what's 42 about? Anyway, so it was all this complications, but it turned into a big success, and it's still, 30 years later, still selling, which gives me no end of pleasure. But there's no way we could have tested that and succeeded.
I'll give you 2 examples from me from my Best Buy days. Is when we had an idea when we were opening in New York City that we do a Sting concert in Central Park. You can't test that, and you can't even ask people, like, which we did, but you can't say, do you want to go to a Sting concert in Central Park for free? I mean, there's no testing there that's going to work. And then we followed up with that, where we took the rights to not to produce, but just to press or manufacture the Rolling Stones 4 Flicks DVD. You can't test that either. But I'll give you one we did test that was a big idea, which is, we had this idea of a loyalty program, which at Best Buy became Reward Zone. We tested that for a while in a single market, just on movies and music, just to see, could we run this through the system without mucking it up? Because if it was going to screw up the cashier, if it was going to screw up checkout, it was going to screw up data. If it was, we're charging $10 for the card. If we couldn't get this all through the system and we put it out nationally, it would actually gum up all of the works. And so to me, testing is completely situational. And if you can test, you should, but if you're making it up, you shouldn't. I want to go on record here too. A whole bunch of stuff that happens where people make up numbers for innovation things is terrible, because they are making up. If it's true innovation, you should say, we think it might do a lot, and we're gonna put it out there and see what could happen. But if you spend all this time like getting a precise thing with your CFO and saying it's going to be like this, it's not an innovation.
Love it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I love the way you broke down this notion of testing for, let's say, the logistical component of it, how it goes through the chain, the value chain, and making sure it makes sense. And then for the Sting concert or the Rolling Stones, whatever, you don't have attribution models that work for that stuff.
Again, you're making it up, and then you're going to hold the team accountable to numbers that are made up. And they're going to then be explaining why they're not making made up numbers. And then they'll be in the forecast, and you're going to miss the forecast. And you create this place where innovation stops. I give one of my biggest arguments has always been, look, there's that whole thing about Ben Franklin flying the kite, right? With the key on it. And I'm like, I think I don't bring a lot of those innovations into sometimes to leadership, because if I say I'm going to fly a kite and see if there's electricity, they will go, do you know how much kites cost? And I'm like, $5. And I'll bury it. You'll never see the kite. And then they will say, if there is electricity, what are you going to do with it? And I will say, I'm just trying to fly the kite and see if electricity exists. And then they will make you do a forecast for electricity exists, which include light bulbs, electric cars, the Hoover Dam, and then distribution of things before you have flown the $5 kite. And for me, that is how innovation gets stopped and crushed, because what happens is you're so far ahead of yourself. You're like colonizing the moon before you've orbited a capsule around the Earth. And you're arguing about it like you know anything, but you don't. And so to me, and I know we're talking about branding and change, but for me, you have to take the gloves off on the innovation front and let a lot of things get tried without trying to put them through I'll call it the performance marketing or the forecasting.
Or the CFO,
Yeah,
or
the
CFO the legal
I've had really good experience with my legal folks by bringing them in early and saying, what are the barriers to me here, versus, yes, just protect me from ruining the company. But it's the demand to forecast an innovation and then everyone getting to vote on the innovation that I think stops the innovation. And I think, honestly, on the marketing side, I love performance marketing is a great tool. You can measure it like crazy, and you can adjust every button on performance marketing you want. It's still last click attribution, or maybe there is some better attribution in that, but you can't put some ideas through that perfect math. It just doesn't work. And when you try and put it through there, what you effectively do is stop it.
Love it. So I wanted to circle back on this brand idea, your experience at Best Buy, and this idea of innovation. And I'm just wondering, were you at Best Buy at the founding of the Geek Squad? And if not, or at least, how was the Geek Squad part of the branding at Best Buy?
Oh, that's one of my favorite stories, because I was.
Yay.
And it wasn't, I was, look, the folks running the service business and the merchants found Geek Squad. I think it was 11 people. And a few of us got together and said, there's going to be room for one brand here, maybe two, but one brand across the US. We should expand this thing like crazy. And so this was really led by the service team and the merchants, and I was running marketing and the call centers then. And so we all got together and said, we're going to expand this at speed. And we went to the board, we gave them a fast plan and a less slow plan, but our whole thing was, first pig to the trough here is going to win this game.
But was there an ROI? What about these performance metrics that we were just talking about?
We did have an estimate of one. We had some estimate of how many computers broke. We did also have a belief that computers were going to be, just the center of the household. And then from my research team, we had a lot of insights, which is you could see it coming early. If your refrigerator broke, you were mad. If your TV went down, you were kind of pissed because you couldn't watch the game. But you could replace those. If your computer went down, your life stopped. And then we had a couple consumer insights that were fabulous, which is people were really mad about it too, because the computer would say things like you put it in and you plug it into the printer at the time, and the computer would say, does not recognize printer. And people were going, of course it recognizes the printer. It says it's a printer. And I don't want to have to bring all this stuff in. They were
I love it.
Like the woman was like, it is telling me it doesn't recognize a printer, printing out a little thing that says doesn't recognize printer. And And that became a lot of the basis for some of our funny stuff. But anyways, so we expanded it. We bought up all the VWs we could. We hired all the call centers. We hired double agents. The service and the merchant folks were great about it. The big argument I was having was why I'm pretty much, I'd like to consolidate brands. I did not want to consolidate Geek Squad, because I thought Geek Squad was going to be something that worked on digital things wherever they went. And Best Buy had a lot of other stuff that wasn't necessarily digital. And at the time, Best Buy wasn't carrying Apple, wasn't carrying Dell, and I thought Geek Squad could work on all this. So we had a big fight, and what I liked about Best Buy at the time, I was arguing with the founder and actually won that fight.
Well, good on him. I guess it was a him. Or there were two of them. For
Nick Schultz, yeah,
relenting.
Yeah, he was really good about it, and but it was pretty good, and then it worked. But the other thing we thought is you could kind of project a couple things, and you were willing to take the risk. And a couple things were, if you could go to people's house, they would pay for it, because the inconvenience factor. And this is a brand promise in a big way, which is, if I have to unplug, at the time, the computers were bigger, and disassociate with my printer, walking in the store and give it to you. Geez, that is really painful. If you could come to my house, that is worth a lot of money to me. And it's also a massive convenience time. And so we figured that would be a good thing. And then we also figured, actually, it's going to be even harder as digital gets bigger. And, everyone's talking about network homes, and they're still talking about network homes now for forever. The idea that you could network a home on your own and do it all really easily, that was probably not going to be, everyone's going to say it's going to be easy, but it was hard enough to just turn on a television for a lot of people. So we thought there was going to be an awful lot of demand.
It was my feeling that the Geek Squad was a tremendous hardcore community within Best Buy. And the second thought I wanted to layer in for you to just riff on is, I always thought a company like Best Buy should have bought the post office, because the access to people's homes that they have, instead of just delivering letters, also being able to help people with their geeky problems, it seems so obvious that was the perfect channel. You wouldn't have to invent people's, and give a reason to drive out to every place. You can just, hey, listen, would you like me to fix something in your house? So that, who didn't have a freaking problem?
As a person who's used the U.S. Post Office for many, many years, I appreciate the concept, but I think, look, the other thing, and you've watched a whole bunch of companies do this, like Amazon with delivery and everybody else, where access to the home is super important, but there's so many different needs that access to the home has. It's not just, and there's so many brands that have to deliver against that. You have all the cable companies, you have all the, you have all the digital stuff coming in the house. You have all the,
and the fridges, and still the fridge.
Yeah, and still the fridge, and all the things you need delivered to your house and then built or set up. If you have kids, for God's sake, you have to build all that stuff that you always have one piece left at the end of the building.
No kidding, so to speak, right? So let's talk about purpose, because we were just talking about these big innovation, the big ideas.
Yeah.
And how do you justify those big things? And I'm just wondering how purpose can be part of that justification, or must be part of that justification.
And when you say purpose, you're talking about the purpose of the company, or the larger purpose of the business, or are you talking the benefit of the brand?
Right. Well, I'm generally talking about the bigger idea. But that's my slant. I suppose, the purpose of some companies or some people is got to make money for the shareholder. So
I would say there's probably 3 levels of purpose, at least to me. The purpose is your fiduciary responsibility to your investors. The second purpose is your promise to your consumers, whether it's B2B or B2C, for the brand, which is, they're giving you money. You should be giving them,
value back.
Yeah, value back that they are satisfied with and happy about, not that they accept. Because in the long run, if they just accept it, they're not going to stay. And then there's the higher purpose, which is, in my mind, a lot trickier. And because I think you need a purpose, but I'm not sure all consumers want you to have a purpose if you're not doing parts 1 and 2. And I also think the purpose for the employees can be different than the purpose for the marketplace, purpose for the company, and purpose for everything else. I do think it's important for companies to have principles and guidelines there in terms of how they operate. And I liked, to me, when I got trained at Procter, it was, the consumer's boss. And we are always going to respect our distribution channels and all this other stuff. And we're going to deliver value in our brands.
Okay, so then tie the knot or circle the square with regard to those big ideas you were talking about, these huge investments, crazy ideas. And so the shareholder, if they had their garble, their opportunity to weigh in, they probably say, well, that's a waste of money. So
risk, I call that's risk mitigation on the big idea. And I think for me, here's how I have always managed it, which is I want the team to be testing or pushing ideas forward as much as possible at speed. If we get to a point we're going to take a big swing like a Geek Squad, or when at Farmers Insurance, for example, we smashed 14 websites into one, where you're going to take a big move, then you have to get people joining that vision in the company and the board. If you do 20 little tests and one of them becomes a bigger test or a bigger effort, and then it becomes a real thing, like a reward zone probably took 3 years to get done. Because first we had to put the data together, and then we had to test it, and then we had to expand it. That one you can have more gates in it. And so my thing is I manage innovation based on what's the fastest, least expensive way I can push the innovation out and then read it for real. And sometimes that has to be a big deal. Like you can't put a half Sting concert in Central Park. It's all or nothing. And you can't launch a National Rolling Stones 4 Flicks DVD. Like you can't test it. Like you can't test toys. So sometimes you have to, I will let the innovation and the marketplace dictate the choice. And then the third factor I will put in will be my board and my fellow leaders, because a lot of times they're going to be the killers of the innovation. And then I think if I have to bring them along, do I bring them along early or do I bring them along late? Because sometimes you don't want them in early and sometimes you do. And I can give you an example of it of when you do. So
yeah, well, it basically speaks to the notion of the enemy inside almost, or at least the notion and importance of having trust amongst your peers.
Yeah, and I think what I will say, if you're doing marketing or revenue, your most rabid consumers are inside your company. They consume everything and they will get tired of all the marketing way before the consumer does, because they read and watch and consume all of it. So I think, all right, certain things you have to bring them along for. I mean, even little things. So like when I got to Farmers, we were in the Rose Parade and I'm like, I don't want to do, let's do something more interesting than a disaster float. And so the team concludes, we're going to marry someone in the Rose Parade. And Rose Bowl parade, and
that's the American football, right? The Rose Bowl.
American football, Rose Bowl. They have the big parade of roses to start, and and my thing is, I could buy time on the broadcast for less than it costs us to build this float, and the float is only on for 20 seconds. Get the float on longer. So the team thinks, oh, you know what? We're going to marry someone. We're going to have this contest around the country, and then we're going to put this up, and then we're going to marry someone on the float. And we're going to tie that into insurance by saying, when you get married, you have to think about insurance more. Huh. And this is the kind of thing where, I have 15,000, we have 15,000 agents, we have claims reps, we have all kinds. I'm going to let the company in on this right away and say, we're going to do this. or when I change the logo at Farmers, for example, I'm going to let everybody kind of in on this, but not let them vote, because I want them to not be surprised. And then I don't want them attacking the idea as it comes out in the wild. I want them ready for it to show up in the wild.
So
And then
that means a lot of storytelling, coaxing, positioning, contextualizing, maybe sometimes arguing upfront to make sure that they get it.
Yeah, and then sometimes you send out little trial balloons to see how hot is this going to be, and sometimes it's really hot, and then you think I may have to adjust that.
Well, in those situations,
the Farmers logo, for example, when I even mentioned that, the whole lead team said it's not going to happen.
Because those sort of things you're going to need to have test numbers to justify, and then isn't that also part of that problem?
Yes, and sometimes you can get them. So when we were changing the logo, for example, at Farmers, what we said is nobody in the company is going to vote. The only voters are going to be consumers, and we're going to run this test. And we're going to run a couple of these tests in the market. And we will bring that back to you, and it will be only what the consumer's saying. It will be our current users, potential users, markets we're not in. We'll let you see. We'll test the old and the new logo. And then we'll bring it back. But you're not going to get to vote, and I'm not going to vote.
Yeah, this notion of you're not getting to vote, that takes some cojones, as they say in Mexican.
Well, once you let voters in, they're going to vote on everything, and so you can't let them in. I think when you're interviewing for the job, you can't. Who's your soccer team or your football team?
Well, Liverpool.
Okay, so if you're the Liverpool manager, you do not want a bunch of the owners and the other functions voting on who you should play. And I think as a marketer, you want the input, but you can't vote the lineup in every day by saying, hey, what do the rest of the lead team think we should, who do you think we should play at Liverpool? They'll change their mind every day.
Well, that speaks to the contract you sign on with, because if you try to negotiate that midway through, or once you've been on board,
it's too late, because all the voters are in, and no one gives up voting rights once they have them.
Good lesson learned there, Mike. And last piece I wanted to talk about, we've mentioned a few times the board. You're on many boards, and it's been my observation for the boards on which I have had the chance to be, that branding, ethics, and purpose are rarely discussed, or at least for the times that I was on the boards, which the last publicly traded board I was on ended about 3 years ago. I didn't see anyway, a lot of discussion around those three topics. And I was wondering to what extent that was your observation, or should it be, should it not be?
So I'm only on one board now, so I'm looking for more. And that's private equity board. I think, again, it's situational depending on how big the brand is. But I do think in general, the language of boards and investors is financial first, everything else second.
Yeah.
And so when I'm going in to talk to boards as a marketer or a revenue person, I am translating all of that into some kind of math. Even if it's not perfect financials, I'm going to talk about retention, acquisition cost, lifetime value, and what that might mean to sales over time. Because I think the board meeting is usually short enough and the board book's so big that if I have to educate you on some function, whether it's distribution or anything else, unless it has massive financial impact, it's hard. It's sometimes hard for the board to pay attention. I think if you get to big brand companies like a McDonald's or Coca-Cola, or I'm sure Procter, they talk about brands a lot because that's the essence of the company. All that said, I think marketing probably could be and should be talked about more at boards, particularly from a segmentation, a target market, and then a acquisition and retention standpoint, without a doubt, because I think one of the things that gets left out in a lot of meetings is the marketplace consumer, whether that's a B2C consumer or a B2B consumer, which is what do they really want and what are they telling us versus what can we sell them?
Yeah.
And where those meet, that's where I think the discussion should be is, are they telling us anything through the financials that we should be looking at from a brand value standpoint or from a competitive standpoint that we're not. And I think a lot of the discussions get hung up in the, gosh, Minter, we want you to sell more stuff. Can you sell more stuff? How about selling these people more stuff? And I'm hyperbolizing this, but I think the real reason should be, what is it going to take for them to buy more stuff? And why aren't they buying more stuff now? And what can we do about it? And the last thing I will say is, a lot of marketers do themselves no favors by firing the ad agency or immediately saying, I'm going to change the advertising, because that says the reason they're not buying, or I'm going to change the sales material. The reason they're not buying is the marketing. When a lot of times the reason they're not buying is the value proposition, or the product quality, or the distribution, or some price, anything. And once you say that, you give everybody the out to say, well, everything else is fine. It's the marketing that's not working.
So the nature of my question included ethics and purpose.
Yeah.
And I relate those heavily to the bigger topic of brand,
Yes.
which involves the promise. And when you think of AI coming on board, it feels like it's a lack on boards not to be talking about ethics and your ethical framework. What are we trying to do? And especially when you mentioned at the very beginning about, companies needing to have a political standpoint, shouldn't these be things that boards are reviewing?
Yes, the ethic thing, I think, particularly with AI coming in and what AI is going to be able to do, both on the efficiency and the effectiveness front, you got to be really clear on that, because if the consumer stops trusting your brand, no matter how good it is, you're going to be screwed. And I think when you look at AI and then what AI might do to search, and what AI might do to programmatic, and what AI might do to just personalized interfaces and distribution of media, it's going to be, and I think talking about that is a really big deal. And then talking about how the brand is positioned in that is really a big deal. And then the ethics around it. I watched Procter do a bunch of things that impacted me, where they would never take a risk with the consumer trust part. They bought back all the Always stuff at retail when Always came out, and they would never ever think of taking if someone tried to give them a trade secret, they would lock that person up, take the book, call whoever the company was, and that was it. And I think you have to be that way even more so now, with the advent of so much going on technology wise, where the technology is ahead of I'll say the technology is way ahead of the ethics, at the ability to manage it, and a lot of times the ability to even see it.
And my feeling, Mike, and I don't have this personal experience, but it's really some intuition that suggests that we should also be really thinking about the employee trust, because they are the ones that see it the most.
Yes.
In the encoding of the AI. They are the ones that will be affected in the job descriptions, whether they are replaced, augmented, with regard to the AI. And if they don't feel trustworthy about how management's dealing with this stuff, I really feel like boards are really, especially, if you're working on private equity, I understand, they're kind of made for money. But for the rest, I really feel like it was a missing topic. And every time I tried to raise it, I failed to bring up those topics, because, as you say, it's all about financials. Give me the numbers.
Well, and I also think the employee contract is evolving at speed, and it's more complicated than ever. And I think there's the employee contract with the company, the employee contract with their fellow employees, the employee contract with the brand, if it's a seriously branded company. But then also the whole bring your whole self to work thing is now a lot of people don't see the problem. Their view of transparency or the problem can be 180 degrees from other groups in the company. And I think managing that in a highly consistent way is very, very important, because if you start picking sides, you'll by definition start pissing off groups of your employees, and they will tell you, or maybe they won't. And I think that is where it's got a lot more complicated.
Yeah, so you started off, Mike, and I love the fact that you brought in your personal side, because my last book, the subtitle was "Why Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader," and that implies, or certainly I talked a lot about this notion of bringing your whole self. Of course, not your naked self, because that's silly, right? But what sort of guidance do you have with regard to this notion of dealing with this fully transparent, bring your whole self to work, and especially in the United States, where it feels very sensitive?
Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing to manage. And I guess my thing is, in my mind, I work for my customers and my investors first, and then my employees are part of that story. But the key thing I always think about is, who is paying me to do things for them, and I have a contract with them first. And by that I mean the consumer is paying me. I cannot, in my mind, breaking that contract or taking sides that make that consumer angry. That's not that's job one to me is meet my consumer's needs. Job two to me is do it in a fiduciary responsible way, because, well, that's my job. And if I'm a public company, I have to do that. And private equity, they want the same thing. And then the third thing is to me the contract with the employees and listening to the employees. But I think a lot of times all those three things don't match up. And I think managing that is one of the bigger challenges. But I will also say, once you give in on one side or the other, man, you could create a bunch of ping ponging, as we just saw with the Budweiser example, where, I mean, your customers are mad, your investors are mad, your employees are probably mad. You have actually managed to hit that perfect, intersection of probably making everybody lose, because you didn't really think that, it's tough to think it all through, but I think that's going to be a case study for a long time, probably.
Certainly believe so. And I always used to say, well, like we talked at the beginning, there's this opacity, but now with access to online shareholder meetings,
Right.
with access to tweets from customers, and so the employee can see what's in the press. We can see what shareholder meetings are being said. We can see how customers are reacting. And in the middle is the employee who gets all of that. So when they see shareholder meetings saying,
Right.
we're really great because we're downsizing and we're making a lot more money.
That's really hard. Well, I think when you look at AI coming in, you're going to see, like, undoubtedly, you're going to have a bunch of, well, people are already saying they're going to downsize. And I think that is managing this it's going to be a challenge.
I know I've eaten in your time, Mike. I did want to ask you one more question, because you worked at Ancestry.com, and I find that that is an extremely interesting brand. Ancestry.com, which helps you define and figure out who you were, the DNA. And I was wondering about how you dealt with privacy and the marketing of a company that was selling such private data at some level. What was your lesson learned in dealing with Ancestry.com?
My lesson learned on privacy for everything, because I was in insurance as well, and I was on a board of a health-like company, the travel nursing company. Is you have to have really great privacy policies. You have to be unyielding in them. Like, for example, Ancestry, to get anything, if you're law enforcement, you have to have a subpoena. And you have to protect privacy. I don't believe that marketing privacy to people, though, helps you tell the brand story. You either are good at it or not. Because I think it was like when Uber said, now we're safer. A bunch of people said, you weren't safe at first. And I think what you should have is super strong privacy policies that are unyielding and available to anybody that wants to talk about them. And you should present them at all the places where privacy is a discussion point. I think it's probably hard to lead a brand with a privacy story, because you want the benefit first. And, but so we were pretty religious about enforcing the privacy rules at Ancestry. We had a privacy lawyer attorney. That was his complete focus.
So it's more like show, don't tell.
To me, yeah. I think telling, if I have to look, if I have to tell you, Minter, that I'm funny, you're not actually going to believe I'm funny. I will either be funny and you will laugh at me and then you will say I'm funny, or not. But if I say, Minter, I'm really funny, it's not going to work for you. And so I consider privacy like that is, I trust you because I've watched you, and if I look for it, I can see it. But if I have to tell you, if I have to tell you I'm safe, or if I tell you I'm really good at this, I think people don't, they don't buy it. You have to prove it to them. So
So
yeah,
the moral of the
show
story is privacy is funny.
exactly. I'm glad you synthesized that so well.
Beautiful. Hey, Mike, how can someone find you, get you on a board, of course, or at least listen to your podcast? What would be the best ways to reach out to you?
Well, thank you for that. So I'm on LinkedIn under Mike Linton. My podcast is called CMO Confidential, and you can find that pretty much anywhere: LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and then all my contact information is up there. My Twitter handle is Michael A. Linton. And so anybody that wants to reach me should.
Beautiful. Mike, thank you so much for coming on. I loved your energy. It was great fun to banter with you about some important topics like branding, purpose, and making money. Because it's if you don't make money, you serve no purpose.
Well, I think in the end, if the company and the brand doesn't exist, it can't do any good. And so I think that's a key thing to do.
That's reality. Mike, many thanks.
Thanks.